The mission statement by Christ is a guide and pattern for our valid operation as kingdom believers. Jesus is our example, and as good disciples, we ought to follow. We ought to imitate, like Paul told us in 1 Corinthians 11. We ought to follow, we ought to imitate the lifestyle pattern and the teaching of our master. The word law is the Greek word nomos. And nomos refers to a custom, rule, or principle that governs human behavior. The law that he's talking about means custom. You know, the Jewish custom was the commandment of God. The Jews have no custom, they have no tradition outside of God's commandment. Outside of God's commandment. So the custom, the rule, the principle that governs human behavior is what Jesus Christ was referring to. The law was the governing principle that governs, that God gave in the Old Testament to regulate the conduct of the life and affairs of the people in the Old Testament. That's what the law was about. So in Matthew 5:17, this is what Jesus is referring to. He's referring to the Mosaic law, the Torah, and the governing principle for human behavior that God gave in the Old Testament. And you know, it is not only Moses that God spoke through. You know, God gave various laws from different prophets. You know, for example, when Moses passed, Joshua took it over. You know, and when they crossed over to the land, new administrative principles and value were put in place. So several prophets, several kings, and so on and so forth, came through whom God legislated the life and regulated the life of the Israeli. You know, all of this is what is being referred to as the law. The word nomos is used 195 times in the New Testament, often referring to the Mosaic law, but also the other laws, customs, principles in the Old Testament. The law was the administrative and management principle for the conduct of the people of God. It is the rule with which their life were conducted. It was their code of conduct. The foundation of their faith in God was passed down, the first generation. The foundation of their faith in God was passed down to the subsequent generation. Paul called the law the schoolmaster, the guide, and the direction, you know, that brought the people to Jesus Christ. That's how important the law was. It was the knowledge upon which the service of God was built. The law was the knowledge upon which the service of God, upon which the foundational service of God was built, on which human relations among both the Israelis and God was based. So if you want to understand how the Israelis are supposed to relate with one another, check the law. If you have to know how God was regulating their life in connection to himself and service, check the law. All their administrative principles and value of life were all stipulated and specified in the law. And as it guides various aspects of life, for example, if you want to marry, what were the requirements of the law? If you want to serve God, you want to do a thanksgiving, what is it about? You know, you want to buy a slave. What type of slave will you buy? how many years would the slave serve, and then to release, and so on and so forth. So it's actually an administrative principle. It was a management principle of the life of the people. In the New Testament, there is a movement toward spirituality from fleshly ordinances. I just want to make this statement as a connection point, to the transition from this Old Testament emphasis to the New. But please follow closely so you will not miss the mark. In Christ, you cannot be spiritual and be carnal at the same time. Put another way, you cannot be spiritual and be fleshly. The two don't go together. Now, we, the End Time Church, and as John Center, have to uphold this same standard of spiritual operation we see in the life of Jesus Christ. If we, the End Time Church, the ecclesia of Christ, if we deviate, if we destroy or break it, then it makes us the least in the kingdom. Tempering with the commandment as it is given demotes our spiritual rank. Everybody say, God forbid. In the Revelation, there's something, say anyone who adds to this word, all the curses in the book will be added. And anyone who take away out of the commandment, his own part will be taken from the book of life. So God is self-sufficient. He does not allow exaggeration or to substitute what he has clearly given as guidance and as commandment to his church. Therefore, all the commandments, the laws, and principles governing human behavior in the Old Testament are still valid for our obedience and execution in the last days. Let me take that again. All the commandments, the law, and principles governing human behavior in the Old Testament are still valid for our obedience and execution in the last days. I will clarify as we go along. Jesus is the activator of the relevance of the Old Testament for the New Testament church. Let me take that again too. Jesus is the activator of the relevance of the Old Testament for the New Testament church. The demarcation, the separation point, the boundary of the Old Testament law and governing principle for only the Jews has been removed in Christ. Has been removed in Christ.